Why does Kyrgyzstan, a country known for its nomadic roots and stunning mountains, still carry so many visible traces of the Soviet Union? From towering statues of Lenin to brutalist apartment blocks as well as wide planned boulevards, the legacy of Soviet rule is etched into the very landscape of this Central Asian republic. But how did this legacy come to shape modern Kyrgyzstan, and how does it still influence the country today? Let's take a closer look at the architecture, monuments, and cultural marks left behind after decades under Soviet control. To understand the Soviet imprint on Kyrgyzstan, we first need to understand how the region became part of the Soviet Union in the first place. In the 19th century, the Russian Empire gradually expanded into Central Asia, including the territory of present-day Kyrgyzstan. Following the Russian Revolution in 1917 and the subsequent Civil War, the region was drawn into the orbit of the newly formed Soviet Union. In 1936, the Kyrgyz Soviet Socialist Republic was officially established as one of the 15 republics of the USSR. From that point onward, the Soviet government launched ambitious plans to reshape society, industry, and even the environment, and the effects were far-reaching. One of the most visible legacies of the Soviet era in Kyrgyzstan is its architecture. Travel to Bishkek, the capital city, and you'll find a cityscape defined by monumental Soviet urban planning. Wide, grid-style avenues lined with trees cut across the city. Massive public squares and imposing government buildings dominate the center. This was no accident. It was part of a carefully planned effort to impose order and display power. Much of Bishkek was constructed or expanded during the Soviet period, particularly after World War II. The city was designed with functionalism in mind, and many of its buildings followed the brutalist and socialist realist architectural styles popular in the Soviet Union at the time. These styles prioritized utility over aesthetics, though many now find their stark concrete designs oddly beautiful in a retro-futuristic way. Take the State Historical Museum, for example. Located in Alatu Square, this giant block-shaped structure is a classic example of Soviet monumentalism. Nearby, you'll find Victory Square, built in 1984 to mark the 40th anniversary of the Soviet victory in World War II. A towering sculpture features 3 bent arcs forming a yurt-like shape, a nod to Kyrgyz culture, but the square is firmly rooted in Soviet symbolism. Even residential areas in Bishkek and other cities like Osh and Karakol still feature rows of Soviet-era apartment blocks. Known as Khrushchevkas, these low-cost, prefabricated concrete buildings were built across the USSR to solve the post-war housing crisis. Though they're often seen as drab or outdated, they still house much of the urban population today. But architecture is only one part of the legacy. Kyrgyzstan is also home to many Soviet-era monuments, some still proudly standing, others gradually disappearing. One of the most striking examples is the statue of Vladimir Lenin in Bishkek. Originally located at the heart of the city in Alatu Square, the Lenin statue was moved in 2003 to a more discreet location behind the State History Museum. Though its relocation reflects the country's move away from Soviet ideology, the fact that the statue remains at all says a lot about the complexity of post-Soviet identity. All across Kyrgyzstan, you'll find similar monuments, from busts of Marx and Engels to war memorials commemorating Soviet soldiers. Some of these are fading into obscurity, while others have become historical artifacts, drawing the interest of both locals and tourists curious about the past. Cultural and linguistic legacies are just as significant. During Soviet rule, the Russian language became dominant in education, government, and business. To this day, Russian remains one of the official languages of Kyrgyzstan, alongside Kyrgyz. Many urban residents, especially in Bishkek, still speak Russian as their primary language. This dual language system is a direct result of Soviet policy. While Kyrgyz was promoted at times, especially in rural areas, Russian was viewed as the language of progress and unity across the USSR. The result is a country where 2 linguistic identities coexist, not without tension, but often with surprising fluidity. The Soviet Union also reshaped Kyrgyzstan's economy. Massive infrastructure projects brought electricity, railroads, and industry to what was once a largely nomadic and agrarian society. Entire towns sprang up around factories, mines, and collective farms. Though many of these industries collapsed after independence in 1991, their foundations still define much of the country's economic geography. For example, the Toktogul hydroelectric plant, built during the Soviet period, remains a key source of energy for Kyrgyzstan today. And many of the country's mining towns, though struggling now, were originally developed to supply resources to the broader Soviet economy. But with independence came new questions. How should Kyrgyzstan deal with its Soviet past? The answer has been mixed. On one hand, there's been a revival of Kyrgyz language, traditions, and cultural identity. The government has promoted national symbols and holidays that reflect pre-Soviet heritage. On the other hand, the Soviet past is not entirely rejected. Russian remains widely spoken, Soviet-built infrastructure is still heavily used, and many older generations remember the era with some degree of nostalgia. In fact, parts of the Soviet legacy have even become tourist attractions. Travelers interested in history often seek out old Soviet mosaics, statues, and buildings. Vintage ladas and Soviet-era murals can be spotted in small towns and mountain villages, offering a glimpse into a world that once stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean. Still, not all remnants of the USSR are seen in a positive light. Some Soviet-era buildings have fallen into disrepair. Environmental damage caused by outdated industrial practices still affects certain regions. And the centralized control of the Soviet period left behind a bureaucratic system that can still pose challenges today. So, how does Kyrgyzstan move forward? For many, the answer lies in balance, embracing the future while preserving the past. The Soviet era is not something that can simply be erased. It shaped the cities, languages, and even daily rhythms of life in modern Kyrgyzstan. But it's also just one chapter in a much longer story, a story that includes nomadic empires, Silk Road caravans, and a vibrant, independent culture. Today, Kyrgyzstan is writing its own future. Yet the echoes of the Soviet Union remain, not as a shadow, but as a backdrop to a country finding its own way in the 21st century. Whether you're exploring the grand avenues of Bishkek or tracing Soviet murals in quiet mountain villages, you'll find the past and present woven together in fascinating ways. And understanding this Soviet legacy helps explain the story of Kyrgyzstan. Thanks for watching. Have you ever been to Kyrgyzstan?